Those enemy fought to the last. They just wouldn't back down. They wouldn't give up. They were high on drugs.
Thanks to our Breaking Brit moment, some 12 million Chinese ended up addicted to the powerful opiate.
Imagine the forbidden elixirs of the Egyptian pharaohs and the sacred rituals of the Greeks, where opium and cannabis were more than mere remedies. They were keys to unlocking the divine. The 20th century saw drugs transform from sacred to controversial, shaping society's laws and ethics in ways that continue to reverberate today. Join us as we uncover how these powerful drugs changed throughout history. The ancient times. Throughout history, psychoactive substances have had a variety of purposes in societies around the world, ranging from medicine and ceremonies to possible recreational use. This research begins in the ancient Near East and progresses to ancient China and Greece, examining how these early civilizations used mind-altering substances in their activities. Opium production and consumption were widespread in ancient Mesopotamia throughout the 4th millennium BC. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that Mesopotamian communities were familiar with opium, a drug derived from the poppy plant. Researchers recently examined residues in ceramics and jars from this era and discovered evidence of opium. This evidence supports the usage of opium in ritual situations. For example, a unique kitchen was discovered in a 4,000-year-old palace in Ebla, Syria, and it contained remnants from opium-producing plants such as poppies. This area, with its huge capacity of pots and hearths, could have been used to make psychoactive concoctions for ceremonial purposes, implying that opium was employed in ritualistic acts, possibly to cause altered states of consciousness. Cannabis first appeared in therapeutic and religious contexts about the 3rd millennium BC, mainly in ancient China and India. Cannabis was utilized in funerary rites, according to archaeological findings from the Jirzhankal cemetery in western China, which dates back to roughly 500 BC. Researchers discovered chemical traces of cannabis in ancient incense burners, implying that cannabis was used to create altered states of consciousness, maybe as part of rituals to speak with the divine or deceased. This early use of cannabis emphasizes its importance in ancient Chinese spiritual traditions. Simultaneously, ancient India used cannabis in religious rites and therapeutic practices. The plant's psychedelic effects were discovered and utilized, although detailed facts concerning its use in ancient India are scarce. Historical writings and archaeological data indicate that cannabis was used in a variety of contexts, including spirituality and healing. As we moved into the 2nd millennium BC, alcohol became a popular hallucinogenic stimulant among ancient cultures. Evidence from the Fertile Crescent suggests that alcohol manufacture originated about this time. The fermentation of grains and fruits to make alcoholic beverages was a great breakthrough. Beer and wine, for example, were popular in ancient Egypt because of their intoxicating properties, as well as their significance in religious and social rites. Alcohol-based rituals were prevalent, with beverages presented to gods and drunk during rites. By the 1st millennium BC, the usage of psychotropic substances had evolved in ancient Greece, Rome, and India. In Greece and Rome, drugs such as henbane and soma were utilized, often for religious and therapeutic purposes. Henbane, a hallucinogenic herb, was utilized in a variety of rituals and may have had psychoactive effects. The Greeks believed that henbane could alter consciousness and induce visions, so they incorporated it into their religious ceremonies. In ancient Rome, opium was a well-known drug used to treat pain and sleep difficulties. Its use was widespread, but it had addictive properties. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, for example, used opium on a regular basis to relieve pain caused by his medical ailments. This suggests that opium was not simply a therapeutic substance, but it could also lead to addiction. Another intriguing facet of psychoactive chemical use is the concept of soma, a ritual drink recorded in ancient Indian Vedic writings. Soma, whose exact identification is still questioned, was a valued substance used in religious rites to produce altered states of consciousness and assist spiritual experiences. Its preparation and consumption were essential to numerous rites and sacrifices to deities, highlighting its significance in religious practices. The interaction of psychoactive substances and ancient cultures presents a complex picture. In the Near East, opium and other drugs were likely used for both therapeutic and ritual purposes. Cannabis and soma were used extensively in spiritual rites and healing in ancient China and India. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece and Rome, drugs such as henbane and opium were used in both religious rituals and daily medicinal treatments. Modern archaeological techniques, such as residue analysis, have shed new light on the ancient use of these drugs. The finding of opium residues in ancient pottery, as well as the examination of cannabis in funerary contexts, have aided scientists in understanding the substance's historical relevance. Drugs all around the world. Tobacco, opium, cannabis, and coffee have long and diverse histories, reflecting their complicated functions throughout nations and ages. Their applications have progressed from ancient practices to present times, exhibiting changes in perception, implementation, and regulation. Tobacco was first employed by indigenous peoples in the pre-Columbian Americas, where it was grown for medicinal and ceremonial uses. Christopher Columbus found tobacco on his journeys and introduced it to Europe in the late 15th century. By the mid-16th century, Europeans had generally adopted tobacco, with French ambassador Jean Nicot playing a crucial role in its popularization. Nicot first introduced tobacco to France in 1556, then Portugal in 1558, Spain in 1559, and England in 1565. By the early 17th century, tobacco had become an important crop in North America. Tobacco was successfully produced in Virginia by Englishman John Rolfe in 1612, and it became the colony's major export within 7 years. This increased the need for labor and fueled the transatlantic slave trade. Initially, tobacco was used for pipe smoking, chewing, and snuffing. Cigars, which have existed since the early 1600s, became popular in the early 1800s. Cigarettes, in their most basic form, have existed since the 1600s, but they only gained popularity in the United States after the Civil War, when bright tobacco, a distinctively cured leaf from Virginia and North Carolina, was introduced. In the late 1880s, James Buchanan "Buck" Duke invented a practical cigarette-making machine, which increased cigarette sales even more. The early health effects of tobacco were poorly known. European physicians first believed Native Americans' claims about tobacco's therapeutic benefits. It wasn't until the early 20th century that scientists began investigating the health consequences of smoking. In 1930, researchers in Cologne, Germany, discovered a statistical link between smoking and cancer, and Dr. Raymond Pearl of Johns Hopkins University stated in 1938 that smokers lived shorter lives than non-smokers. Regardless of these findings, public awareness was low. A watershed moment occurred in 1952 when Reader's Digest published Cancer by the Carton, which raised public awareness and resulted in a drop in cigarette sales for the first time in 2 decades. In response, the tobacco industry established the Tobacco Industry Research Council in 1954 to combat health concerns, pushing filtered and low-tar cigarettes as healthier alternatives, resulting in a temporary increase in cigarette sales. The 1960s presented additional problems to the tobacco industry. The Surgeon General's Advisory Committee on Smoking and Health published a report in 1964 associating smoking with lung cancer, particularly in women. This resulted in regulations, such as the 1965 Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act, which mandated health warnings on cigarette packets, and a 1971 ban on television advertising. By 1990, smoking was outlawed on interstate buses and domestic flights of 6 hours or fewer. Lawsuits against tobacco firms proliferated, with Mississippi filing the first large case in 1994 to recover Medicaid costs associated with smoking. Despite these rules, tobacco firms were able to evade significant legal consequences for decades, thanks to their vast legal resources. The Cipollone case in 1983 demonstrated the difficulty of holding firms accountable since the first rulings were overturned, and the family was eventually forced to drop the lawsuit. However, in the 1990s, legal developments began to alter the scene. New state laws and precedents increased manufacturers' responsibility, and the concept of strict liability evolved, holding firms accountable even in the absence of demonstrated fault. Opium has a long and complex history. Opium was utilized medicinally by ancient civilizations, including the Assyrians in the 8th century and the Sumerians, who referred to it as the plant of joy. Theriac, a medicine containing opium and up to 64 additional chemicals, was used to treat a variety of diseases and was widely trafficked. By the 14th century, opium was a popular treatment in England, used to induce sleep and relieve pain. Laudanum, a combination of opium, water, and alcohol, was especially popular in the 16th century. Paracelsus, an Italian botanist, created the term laudanum, and in 1660, English physician John Sydenham popularized liquid laudanum. Opium was essential for treating insomnia, pain, and cholera, but it also had strong addictive characteristics. Cannabis has a similar ancient history. Cannabis has been used for thousands of years, and ancient Indian literature, particularly the Vedas from roughly 1500 to 500 BC. Cannabis, known as bhang in Sanskrit, was an essential component of Ayurveda, India's traditional health system. Cannabis is also associated with the god Shiva, according to Hindu traditions. Cannabis was used medicinally and spiritually in ancient India, and it was listed as a cure for a variety of ailments in literature, such as the Sushruta. Hemp was also utilized in textiles and industrial products, such as plaster, to preserve the artwork. Coffee has a unique history, having been discovered in Ethiopia in the 9th century. According to legend, a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats become especially lively after eating coffee berries. An abbot at a nearby monastery then utilized the berries to make a stimulating beverage. Coffee moved to the Arabian Peninsula, where Yemeni Sufis used coffee to improve concentration during spiritual rites. Coffee had become popular in the Middle East by the 16th century, with coffee houses serving as hubs for social interaction and intellectual discourse. Despite initial opposition, Pope Clement VIII approved coffee and declared it appropriate for Christians. Coffee reached Europe in the mid-17th century, with the first coffee houses opening in Oxford in 1650 and London in 1652. Samuel Pepys recognized their importance as hubs of news and discourse. By 1675, England had over 3,000 coffee houses, some of which provided lodging and served as important social organizations, and they were frequently compared to the current internet in terms of information dissemination and discussion. Opium and the American Civil War. Opium was introduced to China and East Asia, most likely in the 6th or 7th century AD, via the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that connected Europe to Asia. This region, which extends from Afghanistan and Pakistan to India, Myanmar, and Thailand, remains a major opium producer. In the 1700s, British expansion into India resulted in the control of large poppy production areas. Instead of halting opium production, the British began transporting it from India to China via the East India Company. The British exploited their profitable trading earnings to purchase and export Chinese products, such as tea, silk, and porcelain to Europe. This trade caused widespread opium addiction in China, causing the Qing dynasty to prohibit its importation and cultivation. The British responded to China's prohibition with two violent wars known as the Opium Wars. During the First Opium War, Britain used gunboat diplomacy to force China to keep its ports open for commerce. The Treaty of Nanking, which ended the First Opium War, resulted in China handing Hong Kong to Britain. The Second Opium War exacerbated tensions. Britain joined France in demanding the legalization of the opium trade, as well as additional concessions, such as foreigners' property rights. The Opium Wars and subsequent addiction were generally condemned as unethical misuse of power. British parliamentarian William Ewart Gladstone denounced the First Opium War as a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace. Gladstone's critique was informed by his sister Helen's battle with opium addiction. China's defeat in the Opium Wars signaled the start of the Century of Humiliation, a period of servitude that lasted until the end of World War II and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. During the 1849 gold rush, thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived in America, bringing with them the practice of smoking opium. This resulted in the construction of opium dens in Chinatowns across the West. By the 1870s, Opium smoking had become popular among many Americans, causing San Francisco to establish legislation in 1875 to prohibit its usage. This ordinance made it illegal to operate or patronize an opium den. White Americans were concerned about opium usage because of its links to prostitution, crime, and unemployment. These fears fueled anti-Chinese sentiment, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited Chinese immigration for a decade. In 1803, German scientist Friedrich Zerturner extracted morphine from opium. Morphine, a narcotic painkiller 10 times stronger than opium, was frequently utilized during the American Civil War, causing an estimated 400,000 troops to develop addiction. In the late 1800s, researchers looked for a less addictive alternative to morphine. In 1874, English scientist Alder Wright purified heroin from morphine with the intention of creating a safer replacement. Morphine is the precursor to a variety of opioids, including codeine, fentanyl, methadone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, meperidine, and oxycodone. Initially, heroin was utilized medically, but its addictive characteristics were widely recognized. In the 1890s, Bayer, a German pharmaceutical corporation, advertised heroin as a morphine substitute and cough reducer, even suggesting it to children. Because of these medical applications, heroin addiction skyrocketed in the United States and Western Europe by the early 20th century. Black tar heroin, a dark, sticky type of heroin, has been widely available in the United States west of the Mississippi River since the mid-1990s. In contrast, powder heroin, frequently imported from Colombia, dominates the eastern United States. In 1908, with opium use in the United States at an all-time high, President Theodore Roosevelt nominated Dr. Hamilton Wright as Opium Commissioner. Wright said that the United States took more habit-forming pharmaceuticals per capita than any other country and had fewer safeguards than Europe. Opiate addiction, including heroin, morphine, and narcotic pain medications, frequently results in physical dependence. Users must increase their doses to avoid withdrawal symptoms, which might have serious implications. The National Institute on Drug Abuse estimates that between 26 and 36 million persons globally abuse opiates. In the United States, around 2.1 million people abuse prescription opiate pain medications, with approximately 400,000 addicted to heroin. Opiate addiction rates and accompanying mortality have lately increased. According to the CDC, mortality from synthetic opioids climbed by 72% from 2014 to 2015, while heroin-related deaths increased by roughly 21%. This spike is viewed as an epidemic, necessitating efforts to address and counteract the effects of addiction. Opiates were essential in military medicine during the Civil War, helping to alleviate pain and regulate illness symptoms. However, this practice resulted in addiction among soldiers, both during and after the war. By 1895, opioid addiction had spread beyond veterans, resulting in America's first serious opioid crisis. Prior to the Civil War, opium tablets and laudanum were commonly prescribed. The increased use during the war, as well as the advent of the hypodermic syringe, raised the danger of addiction. Addiction became more widespread after the war, affecting many people, including professionals. The opioid crisis was characterized by overprescribing and insufficient treatment options. As the 19th century came to a close, breakthroughs such as the germ theory of illness, vaccinations, and new pain medications like aspirin all helped to diminish opiate consumption. By the 1890s, medical education had emphasized the hazards of addiction, prompting stricter limits on opiate sales and prescriptions. Early 20th century regulations, such as the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 and the Anti-Heroin Act of 1924, were considerable efforts to control and prohibit opiates. Heroin was outright prohibited in 1970, causing a fall that lasted until its return in the late 1990s. Despite legislative reforms, opiate addiction remains a major concern, with ongoing efforts to limit supply and demand through regulation and treatment programs. The World Wars and drug use. During World War I, cigarettes were widely provided to soldiers, contributing to a significant increase in smoking. Prior to the conflict, fewer than 0.5% of Americans smoked. By the end of the war, more than 14 million Americans had started smoking on a regular basis, demonstrating how wartime habits can influence civilian behaviors and health patterns. Drug use among soldiers increased significantly. Amphetamines were freely supplied to military troops on both sides. The Nazis adopted Pervitin, a type of crystal meth, to raise confidence, battle weariness, and improve performance. Pervitin was extremely popular among German troops, with approximately 35 million doses delivered to German forces during the invasion of France in July 1940. The widespread usage of stimulants contributed significantly to the Wehrmacht's quick advances early in the conflict. The Germans also created cocaine-laced chewing gum to keep soldiers attentive, but chronic use resulted in several mental breakdowns. These cases highlight the darker side of wartime drug use, in which the short-term benefits were outweighed by long-term psychological harm. Drug use evolved with later battles. During the Vietnam War, speed, also called dextroamphetamine, became the most popular stimulant. Between 1966 and 1969, the US government issued more than 200 million tablets of this medication. Unlike prior stimulants, speed outperformed Benzedrine, which was utilized during World War II. Despite its usefulness in keeping alertness, speed was given without sufficient dosage control, resulting in abuse and negative side effects. In addition to speed, marijuana, heroin, and opium were commonly used by soldiers in Vietnam. At least half of the soldiers used marijuana, with approximately 30% using opium and heroin. This extensive drug usage had serious implications, including increased addiction rates and psychiatric disorders among veterans. The use of amphetamine and other drugs during the Vietnam War is sometimes seen as a forerunner to the substance abuse issues that many veterans had upon returning home. Adolf Hitler's drug use during World War II complicates the history of wartime drug intake. In his book Blitzed, German author Norman Ohler describes how the Third Reich was inextricably interwoven with drug use. Hitler was extensively reliant on a variety of narcotics, including Eucadol, which caused euphoria and impaired judgment, and cocaine, which he began using regularly in 1941. These medicines were administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodore Morell, who also treated other prominent figures like Benito Mussolini. Ohler's research suggests that Hitler's chemical addiction had a substantial impact on his decisions and behavior during the war. His addiction caused erratic conduct and poor decision-making as the fight escalated. When drug supplies ran low, Hitler had severe withdrawal symptoms such as paranoia and psychosis. This reflects the overall influence of drug use on military and political leaders during warfare. Stimulant use was not limited to the Axis nations. During World War II, Allied forces relied on medications such as Benzedrine. According to records, soldiers were ordered to take 5 milligrams to 20 milligrams of Benzedrine every 5 to 6 hours, and the Allied forces took an estimated 72 million amphetamine tablets. While these stimulants helped soldiers get through extended operations, they also had negative health implications. Following World War II, drug use among military personnel continued to change. The Vietnam conflict, also known as the First Pharmacological Conflict, resulted in unprecedented drug usage. The United States military used speed, steroids, and painkillers to help soldiers cope with extended battles. A 1971 report stated that between 1966 and 1969, the military forces supplied 225 million amphetamine tablets. This heavy use resulted in increased violence, addiction, and mental health problems among veterans. According to the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, 15.2% of male and 8.5% of female veterans suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. High drug usage throughout the conflict is thought to have exacerbated these mental health problems. In modern conflicts, such as the Syrian civil war, combatants continue to take drugs. Captagon, an amphetamine, is popular among fighters because it causes pleasure, increases energy, and reduces fear. However, Captagon has serious long-term side effects, including psychosis and cardiovascular difficulties. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. The Vietnam War was one of the most brutal and drawn-out conflicts of the 20th century. The Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force that fought against the South Vietnamese government and its principal ally, the United States, operated under extremely harsh conditions. The Viet Cong fighters often spent weeks or even months in the dense jungles, fighting a more technologically advanced enemy. To cope with the extreme physical and psychological stress, many Viet Cong fighters turned to drugs, particularly opium and heroin. The guerrillas often lacked proper medical supplies, so they used opiates to numb the pain from injuries sustained in battle or from the grueling conditions of jungle warfare. The horrors of war, including witnessing death and destruction, took a heavy toll on the fighters' mental health. Some fighters believed that using these drugs helped them maintain a certain level of detachment and fearlessness in battle. The numbing effect of the drugs could make them less sensitive to pain and more willing to engage in dangerous missions. Crack cocaine epidemics and war on drugs. The crack cocaine pandemic, a major catastrophe in the United States, erupted in the 1980s and early 1990s, altering American society in far-reaching ways. This crisis not only increased crime and violence in inner-city areas, but also resulted in harsh criminal justice remedies and a significant increase in incarceration rates. In the early 1980s, cocaine powder, which was predominantly trafficked into the United States through Miami from Colombia via the Bahamas, saw a steep price drop, up to 80%, due to greater availability. To profit from the price decline, drug dealers began turning cocaine powder into crack cocaine, a solid, smokable form of the drug. Crack is created by combining cocaine, baking soda, and water, then heating it to form solid crack rocks, which crackle when smoked, giving the drug its name. Crack's initial purity of more than 80% made it more potent and affordable than powder cocaine, which was about 55% pure and sold for around $100 per gram. Crack could be purchased for as cheap as $2.5 in some locations, making it widely available. By 1981, the crack had spread to large cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and Miami. The term crack was first used in the media in 1980 by Rolling Stone, which highlighted its catastrophic impact. The crack had been connected to an increase in cocaine-related medical emergencies by 1985, with numbers jumping from 23,500 to 55,200 in 1986. By 1987, crack had been detected in all but 4 states. The media frequently overstated the severity of the crisis, resulting in moral panic. Researchers such as Roland Fryer, Stephen Levitt, and Kevin Murphy developed a crack index using data from arrests and drug raids, demonstrating that crack use was most prevalent in the Northeast, notably in areas like New York and Philadelphia. The crack epidemic disproportionately impacted African American communities. Crack use was common in low-income inner-city communities where many African American families resided. Between 1984 and 1989, the homicide rate among young black males more than doubled. The epidemic also resulted in higher fetal death rates, low birth weight newborns, more firearms arrests, and an increase in children entering foster care. A 2018 study discovered that the crack epidemic has long-term consequences, contributing to persistently high murder rates among young black males, even 17 years after it was introduced. In response, the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act enacted harsh sentencing rules. Under this rule, possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine resulted in a mandatory 5-year imprisonment, whereas 500 grams of powder cocaine resulted in the same penalty. This gap was regarded as discriminatory since crack cocaine usage was more widespread among African Americans, whereas powder cocaine use was more popular among whites. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 lowered the disparity, but the damage caused by previous policies was already significant. The crack epidemic caused a huge increase in incarceration rates. By 2000, the number of incarcerated African Americans has surged 26-fold since 1983. By 2012, African Americans made up 88% of those imprisoned for crack charges. Crack cocaine punishments were typically longer than heroin sentences, ranging from 10 to 20 years, instead of 5 to 10 years. The War on Drugs, launched by President Richard Nixon in 1971, was intended to curb drug trafficking and usage. Nixon's proclamation of drug misuse as the public enemy #1 prioritized criminal enforcement over public health and therapy. Cannabis was characterized as having a significant misuse potential and no medical usefulness, despite contrary suggestions. The war on drugs persisted under the following administrations. President Ronald Reagan's administration saw increased media coverage of crack cocaine and support for draconian drug legislation, such as the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. Despite these restrictions, medicine availability and prices have remained high. President George H.W. Bush continued Reagan's policies while increasing military and law enforcement measures against drugs. While retaining a harsh attitude, the Clinton administration signed the Violent Crime Control and Rule Enforcement Act of 1994, which included the federal 3 strikes rule and prison expansion money. The opioid epidemic erupted in the 1990s with 3 phases: overprescription of legal opioids, increased heroin usage, and the introduction of synthetic substances such as fentanyl. The George W. Bush administration linked drug trafficking to international terrorism, extending the drug war. The Obama administration began to respond to complaints of prior practices with the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which reduced the sentencing difference between crack and powder cocaine, and the Cole Memo of 2013, which allowed states to regulate cannabis without federal intervention. Under President Donald Trump, drug policy toughened once more. Attorney General Jeff Sessions revoked the Obama-era cannabis policy, resulting in increased federal enforcement. However, Trump signed the First Step Act in 2018, which made the Fair Sentencing Act amendments retroactive. In recent years, drug policy reform has gained traction. The MORE Act of 2020 aimed to decriminalize cannabis at the federal level and reinvest in communities impacted by the drug war. As of 2024, numerous states have implemented drug liberalization policies, such as cannabis legalization and decriminalization of specific narcotics. The Biden administration has tackled the opioid problem and reconsidered cannabis categorization, indicating a shift toward a more balanced drug policy. The focus is increasingly on synthetic substances, such as fentanyl, with continuous global and domestic attempts to reduce their impact. Despite policy changes, the crack cocaine epidemic and the war on drugs continue to have an impact on American drug policy and criminal justice systems. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.